Okay, so maybe the first place I will start, just so that we're all on the same page about this. I think initially when we were promoting the experiment, we weren't clearly articulating this piece, and I think it's a really important piece. So the reason I call this digging through the toolbox, and this is sort of a condensed version of the presentation I give generally about the project, is because nothing that we're proposing that we're doing is novel, right? We're not arguing that we're inventing new silvicultural practices and applying them in ways that are novel. What we're arguing is that, much like foresters have always done, is we're digging through the range of tools that we have to apply to a forest to meet a set of objectives. And in this case, the aim is forest persistence. So keeping forests on the landscape, whatever they may look like. You'll see as we go through this a little bit, the aim really is to just push boundaries a little. So take what we already use and what we already know and push it a little further, given the stressors that we're dealing with here. Here I have listed just the core AMEX team co-PIs. So Rob York is at UC Berkeley, Ricky Satomi is UC Cooperative Extension, Ariel Roughton is the Blodgett Forest Manager, and then Connor and Bryant are permanent research associates in my lab. And this project was developed in collaboration with the CAL FIRE FRAP team, Fire and Resource Assessment Team, Assessment Program, and then the State Forests, which Kevin leads. Just want to note that really quickly. So before we move on, I just want to define forest persistence potential really broadly. So every scientist or lab sort of has an umbrella or a platform upon which they do science and ask questions. In my lab, we're looking at forest persistence potential. And what I mean by that generally is we obviously have all of these factors that influence where a tree occurs, whether or not it can grow, and whether or not it survives. And we can scale it up to a population or a species level. The reality is that many of these factors are stressors, right, that limit where an organism can occur. And with current forest conditions, it's even more stressful to be a tree for a whole host of reasons. And so in our lab, what we've been focusing on is how can we keep a forest on the landscape, whatever that may look like, and to meet a particular set of objectives that a forest manager has. And you'll see this as we go through this presentation, as we talk about it. But really simply, the reason we've gone this route is that as we have started to study forest ecosystems across the West over the last decade under the impacts of pest management and climate change and uncharacteristic fire and beetle outbreaks, we've realized that the forests that are regenerating on many of these landscapes are not the same as they were. And regardless of how we're managing them, we are not getting the same outcome. And so as a lab and a sort of a research group, we've scaled back a little to think about, all right, so I'm not going to use redwood because you all love redwood. Sequoia. In the Sierra Nevada, our focal species that everyone's concerned about is giant sequoia. Everyone wants there to be giant sequoia in these locations where it has always occurred, but the reality is it may not. And so we've been trying to find a way to assess how we can keep whatever forest on those landscapes, even if giant sequoia is absent from them. So really generally, that's how we are defining this forest persistence potential. And the bottom line is we're just asking, how can we keep forests on the landscape, ideally healthy ones, is really the aim. So with this, going back to all of our silviculture 101 classes from undergrad, right, which I often have to remind my colleagues about what we're doing here. One is, as a forester, you are defining objectives, right? And you all know what objectives are, but across the board, people confuse goals with objectives, right? As a simple reminder, objectives are quantifiable, right? Like I'm going to burn 100 acres this season, right? That's an objective that's quantifiable that I can potentially meet, right? Reducing fire hazard potential is a goal, right? It's a very overarching thing that sure you could do, but how are you quantifying that, right? And so when we're thinking about, from a silvicultural framework, we're thinking about defining objectives and then making sure that we're meeting those objectives, right? And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here of much of this call, but this is in essence what a forester does. But this is what we're trying to make sure that we're doing across the board on the landscape. So out of that was born this adaptive management experiment, which Kevin gave us a very nice overview of already, but sort of the two overarching goals, right, which are not necessarily quantifiable, are to increase ecological understanding and to inform forest management, right? So thinking across the range of the species, given where we are in the Sierra Nevada, what we can do to promote forest persistence potential, And the aim is to identify tools by which we can do that, and to guide planting. Yeah, of course, Mark, I agree. Mark has a comment. I'm trying to make sure I'm on the chat too about uncharacteristic wildfire instead of catastrophic. We could have debates about that after the fact, right? Thinking about severity and impacts on the forests and what that looks like. But I try to be careful with my words. So catch me if I'm not careful. Thank you for that. And then in my lab, and what we're doing in this experiment is really asking these three general questions. So how have the conditions that we created already or are creating currently influencing forest stand condition and stand dynamics? What are the consequences of those conditions on tree regeneration, growth, and survival? And what silvicultural practices can we apply under increasingly stressful conditions? And again, the overarching question is, how can we promote forest persistence potential? So really just to get this out of the way, since it is a climate change study, obviously, there is obviously a rising threat on the landscape. A number of studies across looking at California over the last 30 to 40 years have shown repeatedly that this sort of aridity or drying effect that we're seeing across the state of California is strongly correlated with the amount of area that we're seeing burned on the landscape. What I would argue, though, which I think many of you are aware of, and I also recognize the coast redwood system is different, right? But generally speaking, across Western forests is we already had some cracks in the foundation to begin with, right? We're not starting with this, for lack of a better word, pristine ecosystem, right? That is unimpacted and that all of a sudden we're overlaying warming temperatures and drying conditions on. At least in the Sierra Nevada in particular, and across much of the redwoods, we clear cut, for example, the Tahoe Basin on the left side. This image is Spooner Summit, which is not far from University of Nevada, Reno. This is an ecosystem that is not adapted to a high severity disturbance. It's historically a low to moderate severity fire or low severity insect and disease outbreaks generally. We altered the ecosystem by clear cutting it to begin with. And then obviously we have now 150 plus years of first exclusion of indigenous burning across the Sierra Nevada, and then active fire suppression policies that have altered sort of the character of the forest. So for better or for worse, we're dealing with different conditions anyways, and then overlaying warming and drying on top of that. Really, what we're attempting to do is try to keep our forests out of these three states on the right. So this is from a paper by Connie Millar, who's now a retired forest ecologist from the Forest Service, and Nate Stevenson, who is a USGS biologist based out of Sequoia Kings National Park. What they proposed in this paper in 2015 is we're having all of these massive disturbance events across the globe. And there are four potential responses. The first response is this response 1 on the left, which I have sort of blurred out. And that's really forests functioning as we would expect them to do. So they maintain their services, they maintain their composition, and they're not yet impacted by the disturbances at hand. The 3 on the right are more what we're working with in the Sierra Nevada and increasingly what we're working with across the West. So the second response is you see some changes in the ecosystem following a disturbance, but the system is able to maintain its services at some level, whatever those may be. Oops, sorry about that. Response 3 is that the ecosystem changes and then you start to see a decline in services, whatever those may be. So recreation, timber, water, wildlife habitat, etc. And then the fourth response is we see a complete type conversion. Why I focus on this and why this has been an image I've shown in our Sierra Nevada AMEX is because what we are seeing in the Sierra Nevada is the 3 on the right. And in most places, we are seeing response 3 and response 4. So in the mixed conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada, we are seeing some type conversion at lower elevation and lower latitude, which is changing the services we can provide and leading to changes in how we can look at and manage those ecosystems in general. So really quickly, Kevin already defined these, but I will just redefine them so that we're all on the same page. We do use terms that were developed by Connie Millar, Nate Stevenson, and Scott Stevens in a 2007 paper that was arguing for how we could connect some of these ecological concepts to forest management generally. And the 3 are resistance is the first one, which is this idea that we can continue to manage forests, particularly on a sustainable basis, to allow them to resist some level of mortality from disturbance. And so in this image, I have a picture of a giant sequoia, just showing that it has the traits that allow it to resist mortality from most of the fire conditions, assuming that it's managed at the level that allows it to survive. The concept of resilience, which Kevin already articulated, is this idea that the forest, we will have high mortality of that on that ecosystem, but the forest will bounce back in some ways. This is a sort of silly classic example. This is a serotinous pine, right, that has those resilient traits that regenerate after fire. We've redefined resilience in our experiment to think about maintaining heterogeneity in species, in size classes, and in age classes, with the hope that something will bounce back. We're not confident what that may look like given the many stressors on our system, but we will presume a forest is resilient if something is able to come back and keep it as a forest ecosystem. The last one presumes that these mechanisms won't work. Forests will not be able to resist mortality, and or they won't be resistant to mortality from a given disturbance. And so this is where foresters take a different set of actions. And in this action, they're attempting to transition the forest. What you're looking at here is an example of something I'll describe later, but it's a classic provenance trial experiment, where what we are arguing in this experiment is that managers may have to leverage different species and different seed lots in order to maintain forests on the landscape for whatever their services are. And I'll detail this on the right a little bit later. This is not novel to foresters, right? Foresters have long moved trees, right? Monterey pine is the most widely planted conifer across the globe. It's most of New Zealand's forest industry, and yet in its native range, we can barely keep it alive, right? We are well accustomed to this, but a bigger picture, this is something that people are only becoming more and more comfortable with. And even with this idea of moving seed lots, we need a little better information about how we do that, because in general, at least in the Sierra Nevada, we are not moving lots for timber yield. It's for a whole host of other objectives. And the aim here, going back to this Millar and Stevenson's paper, is really the aim is to try to ease forest transitions. So on the top, if you have a high mortality event, by the time you get to that bullet point 2, you see tree mortality, and then the forest has to recover, which means that there's a delay in the ecosystem services provided because you have a period where there's non-forest, or where the forest is converting to something else. The image on the bottom just shows this idea that foresters can help transition forests to an alternate species or an alternate lot before that mortality events occurs. So thinking more about proactive forestry than reactive forestry, which is how we have long managed forests as foresters, but increasingly we are faced with these events that require us to be reactive. And so in this case, in transition, we are looking at testing ways at which we can be proactive in terms of converting forests ahead of time. A really brief overview of how this experiment grew. The initial or flagship site for this experiment is Grouse Ridge. It's a UC Berkeley owned research forest near Nevada City, or Grass Valley, so just north of I-80. From this, we had conversations with CAL FIRE and other entities, and we were able to expand and replicate the experiment at the northern end of the Sierra Nevada mixed conifer forest at Latour Demonstration State Forest, and then at the southern end at Mountain Home Demonstration State Forest. And so on each of these sites, we have replicated the silvicultural treatments at each of these 3. And then additionally, we've added some what we call companion sites. So the 3 large AMEX logos is what you're looking at there, are the core sites. What we mean by that is that every silvicultural treatment is replicated and implemented there. The smaller AMEX logos that are distributed across the Sierra Nevada are our companion sites. So at least one or more of the silvicultural treatments is implemented there as a way to expand our scope in areas where, for example, the Forest Service wasn't able to implement all treatments. So it gives us greater acreage and greater replication, even if it's only of a single type there. What really drove this, on the left were our core sites as of summer 2020. So we had the 3 sites that you saw on the left, Latour, Grouse Ridge, and Mountain Home as our core AMEX sites. Stanislaus Tuolumne Experimental Forest was able to replicate our transition treatments. So they did a harvest and they planted some gardens. Same thing with Esham. But in 2020, during that wildfire season, we watched the Western Sierra burn under these mega fires. And as part of that, we had conversations about, well, we're testing this idea of transition when we actually have landscapes that will potentially transition in front of our very eyes. And so what we did is we leveraged the 2020 and now a few of the 2021 fires to plant some of these provenance trials within these high severity burn landscapes to see how these seed lots will perform differently under the potential for real transition on the landscape. The objectives of each of these just really generally. So again, this concept of resilience is to sort of, in the Sierra Nevada at least, it's mimicking the historic fire regime. So we're using single and group selection in order to create canopy gaps, mimicking single and group tree mortality. As we're marking, we're leaving heterogeneity in structure and species, size classes, and cone crops if we have the potential to do that. And the aim there is to diversify enough so that something will bounce back. Resistance is sort of very much like a heavy, thin from below with an additional canopy harvest. The aim there is to break up canopy continuity so that fire doesn't move through the canopy, which was historically uncommon in this forest type. And then to remove ladder fuels to keep fire out of that canopy. The aim there, especially in the Sierra Nevada, is to leave these best and brightest trees on the landscape in the hopes that they will have the characteristics to resist mortality from a disturbance event and be able to regenerate on that site. But again, very much like a heavy thin from below and a canopy harvest. And then the last is this idea of transition. So assisted migration and assisted gene flow is what we're talking about here. What these look like on the ground, and this is sort of a dated set of images, but our resilience treatment on the left, this is an area where we have a large group opening. And I'm sorry, I always forget to change this to square feet per acre. So the resilience treatments are marked to a residual basal area of 125 square feet per acre. That's pretty low based on the forest practice rules for the mixed conifer forest type in the Sierra Nevada, but we don't have any problem implementing that. The resistance and the transition, which are the two on the right, are marked to 75 square feet of basal area, and that's pretty low for what most of our forests have historically been marked to. Both the resistance and the transition have identical treatments within the matrix of the forest, so this heavy harvest and thin from below. The primary difference with our transition treatments is that we've been punching in 1 acre to 3 acre holes in the forest in order to facilitate the plantings and to transition the forest to these other species and seed lot types. And these are just some images of what you're looking at our grass ridge forest. The baseline for all of these is that we're using natural range of variation, or historic range of variation is the other term used, as our limit for basal area. And so, and again, I'm sorry, these are in meters squared per hectare. I forgot to change it. But historically in the Sierra Nevada, that range was anywhere between about 90 and 150 square feet per acre was on average the basal area we were holding. So we are dropping it to the lower end of that or below that, presuming that that condition will no longer potentially be ideal with increasing drought stress and increasing frequency of fire. So one of the more interesting pieces that I think, which all of you likely do on your own anyways, as you're reforesting sites, is selecting different species and different provenances in the hopes we can identify appropriate lots for reforesting. But really what we're doing here is a little different than saying, okay, Mike, you're going to plant these seed lots from this particular seed zone, right? So we're not going to just bump down an elevation 50 or 500 feet. Instead, what we're attempting to do is say a given lot can tolerate this range of temperature and moisture conditions. And so you want to select lots that ideally have those same characteristics and same adaptations here. So what this looks like from a very simplistic ecological framework is on the x-axis, you have some moisture stress. So on the left is low moisture, on the right is high moisture. And then on the y-axis, we have some metric of fitness. For most plant species, this would be, seed production or fecundity, the ability to produce offspring. For conifers in particular, it's a little hard to sample, so we often use other metrics, right? Like when we're sampling trees in a provenance trial, we sample height or diameter. And science has consistently shown over time that 10-year height is a very strong predictor of 30-year survival in conifers. And so we'll just use that as an example here. You've got height on the y-axis, and then you have 3 different provenances planted. They each overlap, like right here under this peak of provenance 1, the green, all 3 species can grow, right? But only provenance 1 has its optimum growth under those conditions. And so we all know this, right? We know that species co-occur and they have slightly different ideal conditions, but each of them has a peak at which you would optimize their growth for either timber production or whatever your set of objectives are there. What we also know as foresters is that historically populations have been strongly locally adapted, meaning local seed does better in local conditions generally. We've also tested this for a long time, knowing that in terms of timber growth, right, that we can move lots and have higher production if we move lots from lower in latitude or lower in elevation. But generally, we presume that local populations will do better. Going forward, though, one of the major concerns and what we're already seeing manifesting on the landscape is that local lots are not doing better, right? So planting local seed lots is not seeing high survival. And in many cases, planting foreign seed lots, even if it's from a slightly lower elevation or a slightly lower latitude, is leading to greater success. And so we want to test this in a little bit more detail across the range. So what we're doing here, again, with this seed lot tolerance curve is we're attempting to identify this curve for each of these species. So where across this moisture gradient or temperature gradient are these species and or these populations performing the best? And the aim there is to inform some of the seed lot selection tools that are being developed in collaboration with CAL FIRE, but with the Forest Service and with UC Davis for the state of California in particular. We used a metric that is widely used across the Rocky Mountains and across the Pacific Northwest in order to select our seed lots, but I just want to describe it here for you guys. So in general, when we think about moving lots, we often think, I'm going to move a lot from slightly lower elevation or slightly lower latitude, presuming that those lots are better adapted to the drought conditions or the heat conditions that my trees are currently experiencing or will experience in the future. What all these papers in the bottom left here have shown, and a number of scientific studies from the Pacific Northwest and the Rocky Mountains, is that when we do that, often what ends up killing these trees is frost. It's winter temperatures. So yes, those seed lots may be well adapted to growing season conditions, but they are maladapted or they can't survive when they get temperatures in the winter or reduced snowpack that do not allow them to move forward. And so in the end, what we did is we selected seed lots that had low range of variation in climate, in winter climate, meaning their temperatures were very consistent. They weren't exposed to cold, and warm, cold, for lack of better phrasing. And then high variation. So populations or lots that had sort of the extreme of winter conditions there. Presuming that populations that have had the wide range of conditions might be better able to adapt or acclimate to other conditions across the range. What you're looking at here on the left is one individual from each of the seed lots we planted. So for the Sierra Nevada AMEX experiment, we selected 5 of the most widely planted conifers and reforestation in the Sierra. In this conversation here and in conversations with the redwood ecosystem, we could debate till kingdom come about what to include, but this is what the foresters settled on. We wanted to do some oddballs like big cone Douglas fir because it can basally sprout, knob cone pine because it's serotinous, and black oak. There were a whole range of reasons why that didn't happen, and so we stuck with these 5. Here we did Pinus jeffreyi, so Jeffrey pine, incense cedar, sugar pine, giant sequoia, and ponderosa pine. And the map on the right shows you the lots that were ultimately selected. So we used available seed lots from CAL FIRE's LA Moran nursery and seed bank in Davis, and from the US Forest Service Placerville Seed Lab. We only use lots that had location data associated with them. So township range section, for example, or latitude, longitude, so that we could pull climate data. And that's what all the little gray X's on the right are. Those are lots that had climate data that weren't selected. And then each of the dots that are colored in here shows you where we pulled lots from for this experiment. Just an example, I'm going to pull sugar pine, so the purple dots. You can see we have lots that come from the northern Cascades all the way south to the southern Sierra Nevada. And each of these lots is planted at each of our locations so that we can capture and assess sort of their climatic tolerance across this entire range in the Sierra Nevada. On the ground, what this looks like is it's intense, insanely labor and time intensive. And so what you're looking at on the left is our crews at Latour Demonstration State Forest. For those of you who know Jason Proberco, he's in the blue in the middle there. He helped us grid. Is we lay out a grid with flags where we are marking all of the seedlings that are being planted ahead of planting so that we can identify individuals at a given location before they're large enough to be permanently tagged and marked going forward. What you're looking at on the right is what these look like in real time post-planting. So our crews walk this grid after it's planted, and we have known locations for every single microgrid. And so what a microgrid is, and I'm just going to use something that's hopefully obvious. So in the top right corner, hopefully you can see my cursor. This little red blob is Ponderosa Pine seed lot 6. That seed lot is planted in 6 individuals in a cluster. One, for operational purposes, randomly planting this would never have been feasible. We would have planted a few hundred trees instead of 46,000. And 2, the concern is that there are likely microgrid effects. And so we plant 6 here, hoping that if 1 survives or up to 6 survive, we can get data on a minimum of 1 individual or up to 6 individuals. These are also replicated across the gap. So 6 is up here in the top right. It's over here in the center right. Let me see if I can find it elsewhere. You'll probably find it before I do. It's over here in the bottom left, and then it's over here in the bottom sort of center. So it's replicated across so that we can attempt to capture variation across each of these gaps. In each of these gardens, we're also sampling soil moisture, soil temperature, available light, and we have little weather stations at each of these so we can capture weather data. And I will try to wrap this up in the next few minutes. One of the main points I just want to show as a takeaway, and don't stare at this too closely, especially because it's in meters squared per hectare, is that 1, we met our mark in this across all of our treatment units. And 2, that mark is at or below the historic basal area that we were targeting. And so we're within the bounds that we were aiming for across this landscape, and they're slated, or they're in place and ready to experience a disturbance here. Really quickly, just from a survival perspective, what you're looking at here is just survival of species across each of our sites. The site all the way on the right is Esham. It's our in situ climate change site. And so you can see across all species, they have significantly lower survival, between basically 0 for giant sequoia, which is wild because that's one of the sites in its range, up to about 30% for Jeffrey pine. And then one of the takeaways across the board is that Jeffrey pine is really king in terms of survival here. Ultimately, what we'll be doing is developing these climatic tolerances. So looking at the optimum performance of each of these lots across some gradient of climatic stress. This is just an example for giant sequoia using some preliminary data, but this is what these will look like eventually once we have all our data lined out. And then what we're looking at doing here is trying to expand this to the redwoods. So what does this look like? We have funding in collaboration with CAL FIRE to collect data. We've initiated a set of plots at Jackson in collaboration with Lynn and Faye and Mike and Kyle and Kevin. We're looking to expand across the range to other sites, but mostly what we're looking at doing is trying to figure out what these treatments would look like to meet the set of objectives for Coast Redwood. So are they comparable to what we're doing in the Sierra Nevada? Would resilience, resistance, and transition look similar, or would they look completely different given the objectives you guys have at hand? And then one of the first places we're starting is trying to figure out what the current objectives are. I think we have an idea based on the meetings that we've been participating in and based on our understanding of the Coast Redwood Forest. here are some examples that have been put forth in our conversations previously. So fire over and over again is a recurring theme, particularly when we were in Santa Cruz last month. It was a topic of conversation, as was redwood resilience. You know, at the southern end of the range, there were comments about range contraction of redwood due to drought. I recognize that across the gradient of the redwood distribution, there's variation in response, but the point of this project is to think ahead. What can we do now that will mitigate future stressors? And then obviously across at least the northern portion of the range, timber is huge. So making sure we can continue to meet the demands of that objective for these forest ecosystems. And then how do we lay climate change on top of that? So that's really sort of the overarching objective of the meetings that we're having now and in person, is thinking about what are we currently managing for, what do we want to manage for, and what can we maintain into the future? And what does that look like in terms of a prescription in the redwood ecosystem?